This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. In recent years, we've seen social media platforms abused to execute campaigns of genocide in Myanmar, lynchings in India, and in January an attempted insurrection in Washington DC. Whilst people enjoy the right of free speech, incitement to commit illegal acts is an offence, but is it adequately defined for the digital age? I'm Damian Collins, and in this podcast, we'll be discussing these issues with Professor Richard Wilson from the University of Connecticut School of Law and author of 11 books on international human rights, including his latest work, Incitement on Trial, Prosecuting International Speech Crimes. We'll be hearing as well from our regular guest, the disinformation analyst Charles Creel. Richard, it's fantastic to have you with us on the Infotagion podcast. I've been really interested to read the work you've done looking at really the legal framework in America around what constitutes harmful speech when, despite the First Amendment of the US Constitution, speech could be considered to be harmful and therefore could be acted on. And a lot of this seems to go back, as is often the case, to older Supreme Court cases which have sought to define what harmful speech is, and in particular the 1969 Brandenburg versus Ohio case at the Supreme Court. Now, you've analysed that and the limitations of that finding, and I thought perhaps you could explain to the listeners of the podcast, how the legal protections around speech work in America, and how potentially the ability to act against harmful speech is a lot more narrow than might have been considered.
Yes. So for most of the American Republic, speech has been heavily regulated by the government. In the United States, we inherited the British common law, and that protected the sovereign. So the speech rules that prevailed in the United States from 1776 until about 1950 were highly repressive of speech. So here I'm thinking of the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, 4 acts which made seditious speech illegal. Blasphemy was on the books until the middle of the 20th century, the laws against blasphemy. And so the idea that the First Amendment has protected Americans robustly saying whatever they wanted for as long as the Republic has stood is simply a myth. The free speech environment that we enjoy today is really the product of a set of decisions in the 1960s at a time of enormous social upheaval. The civil rights movement, individuals were being held to account for simply calling for civil rights and calling out their comrades onto the streets to protest for their civil rights. And so something needed to change. And the Supreme Court realized that. And in Brandenburg and the decision in 1969, they narrowed significantly the type of speech that could be suppressed. And at the time, this was seen as a good thing for social protest. So what they did was throw off the strictures that had existed under the clear and present danger test, which was the previous test of inciting speech, which was overly broad and allowed the authorities to sweep up any speech that they didn't like. People were put in jail in the 1950s for simply gathering together to read the works of Marx and Engels. So clearly that was not sustainable. In Brandenburg, they create a 3-pronged test, has 3 elements. I'll just run through those very quickly, and then we can talk about them more if you wish. But Brandenburg, for a speech act to be inciting, there has to be direct advocacy of a crime. So that's not oblique speech that perhaps could be seen as having a tendency to advocate a crime. No, it has to advocate lawless action. Secondly, that lawless action has to be imminent, not at some later point or a month later or a year later. It has to be imminent. Now, what the courts mean by imminent is a flexible standard, but more or less it means now or very soon. But in very grave cases, such as murder, the courts have been known to allow 6 weeks as satisfying the imminent standard. So someone went on television in the 1970s and offered $500 for killing a Nazi in 6 weeks' time when the Nazis were marching in Skokie, Illinois, a heavily Jewish area. And he was convicted, Mr. Cohen was convicted of incitement, even though it was 6 weeks away. So that's the imminent standard, the second one. And then the third is probability. The speech has to be, the inciting speech has to have a high likelihood of leading to the imminent lawless action. So for instance, if I advocate the blowing up of Wichita, Kansas with a nuclear weapon, because all of my relatives live there and I want to be done with them, it's not going to be considered incitement because it's not likely, because I don't have a nuclear weapon. So that has meant that the incitement rules have been used very sparingly in American politics and society. There are very few cases for incitement across the United States, and it really has to rise to a high threshold to merit regulation.
I think this is such an important debate for our time now, because the rules of social media companies, their platform rules, seem to be very heavily influenced by American law, understandably, and the ruling of this Brandenburg case, because Facebook in particular will say they will act against harmful content or hate speech if it poses direct physical harm to an individual person, to a named individual person. But I think it doesn't take into account what is the wider impact of the sort of steady drumbeat of hate speech may be directed towards people because of their ethnic background, their religious background, that may not be inciting violence against an individual, but may lead to harm being caused in the future.
Yes, that's a very good point, and that's something that's very important to recognize. Most hate speech, and this is what we're getting from the social science studies that are being done, most hate speech, denigrating speech of, say, a religious group or a racial group or an ethnic group or immigrants, does not have a one-to-one correspondence with an actual physical harm. So most of that type of speech does not directly lead to an identifiable attack on a member of that group. However, what it does is create an atmosphere of tolerance for violence, an atmosphere of intolerance towards that particular group, and it shapes the overall environment in which public discourse occurs. So speech does have harmful effects, and we can call these sort of umbrella or macro causal effects, which are tangible. Now, there have been some very interesting studies, and I'll just refer to one by Muller and Schwartz, who did a study of the Facebook webpage of Alternative for Germany, a far-right German party. They studied their Facebook page in 2017, 2018. They analyzed 700,000 posts and tweets, which is quite a good number. And then they did a statistical correlation with actual hate crimes in Germany against immigrants. And they found that wherever there was an uptick in hate speech against immigrants, there was a higher number of attacks. Now, these are correlations. That means that they go together, but they are not necessarily causal. So I think when we're thinking about regulation of speech, we need to think in two senses. One, in the sense of, okay, some speech acts do directly incite violence against particular groups and may lead to that violence, and there are cases of that. But most of the speech won't rise to that level, but still have negative effects all the same. Now, I think the social media companies have grasped that to some degree. They have been tightening up their hate speech regulations, and they are removing much more hate speech than they were, say, 12 to 18 months ago. So they are moving in the direction of more aggressive regulation of speech. And you can see on Facebook's website, their community guidelines, which tell you about the types of speech that they repress, and they claim to be removing about 70% of that before it even arrives on the platform itself.
And yeah, as always, with Facebook, we don't have any mechanism for verifying their statistics about their performance on that. And I mean, I think one really sort of clear example that we've all focused on this year, of course, was the events leading up to what's been called an insurrection in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of January, where some people have said that it was inflammatory language used by Donald Trump that encouraged people to go on the attack to defend their party and Donald Trump's presidency, and that led to the violent demonstrations in Washington where 5 people lost their lives. But in some ways, the build-up to that started quite some time before, really on the night of the election, in sowing this idea in the minds of people that the election had been stolen. Now, in that case, I mean, do you believe that Donald Trump is guilty of having incited violence through his speeches and the use of social media by his supporters?
Well, the short answer is yes, but I want to give you a little bit of background. I wrote a book about incitement where I analyzed 30 cases from around the world. Hans Fritz and Julius Streicher at Nuremberg, the RTLM radio announcers during the Rwandan genocide, and I looked at the whole spectrum of cases. There were quite a few acquittals, there were some convictions, but looking at the fact pattern for January 6th, the evidence is very compelling that Donald Trump incited a mob to act lawlessly to prevent the certification of the results of an election that he lost. And so this is not a hard case. This is not one of those, oh, well, on the one hand, on the other, let's look more closely at the evidence. So if we go back to Brandenburg and we look at the advocacy prong, after 2 months of claiming falsely that the election was stolen from him, Donald Trump encouraged his followers to fight. He used the word 20 times. He used the word peacefully once. Now, politicians use the word fight a lot. But here's where context matters. What did he mean exactly by fight? Did he mean, let's return to the electoral process and campaign harder? No. What he meant was interfere violently with the process ongoing in this moment in the Capitol building. And we know some of his intentionality by what members of his entourage said. So his lawyer Giuliani says, I want to see trial by combat. Donald Jr. says, Republicans, we're coming for you. What did the audience understand by the meaning of the word, the call to fight? Well, they chanted, hang Mike Pence, and they built a hangman's noose outside of the Capitol building. And they admitted to journalists that they were hunting for Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, in order to harm, maim, or kill her. It was foreseeable that this violence occurred, given the use of his language to fight like hell, and his statements in the run-up to that event that a great injustice had been done, that he had won the election, it had been stolen from him, and all of that was a profound lie. It was imminent because he said, go to the Capitol building right over there, within walking distance, which is what the crowd did. And it was probable. It was likely to occur because the crowd was clearly emotionally charged. So it was foreseeable that his words would lead to the mob attack on our Capitol building on January 6th. But even if that hadn't happened, incitement is an inchoate crime, which means that the conduct is the crime. So I think the only question we need to ask is, did Donald Trump intend to incite the crowd to act lawlessly to stop the certification of the election? And there is compelling evidence that he did.
And I think it's it's a really clear case because we see his advocacy, we see an action taking place. And there's obviously been the failure of the impeachment trial in the Senate, but probably always predictable given the high bar that would need to be met. But do you think it's likely there could be a case brought against him personally for his role in the events of that day?
It's certainly possible. The DC district attorney would be the one with the jurisdiction over that case. And on January 7th and 8th, he gave some strongly worded statements that he was looking at the evidence and that he would, the indictments would follow wherever the evidence led him. Since then, he's backed off that kind of robust speech and perhaps has been waiting for the outcome of the Senate trial. The Senate trial, I should point out, is a political process. It is not a legal process, although it had many legal trappings. It is essentially like the British Parliament setting up its own committee to review the conduct of one of its members. It's a political process. And the fact that there were 57 votes against Donald Trump is significant. No, he was not convicted in the trial, having been impeached. But yes, there were quite a few Republicans, some of them influential, some of them unexpected, who did vote to convict Trump. And Mitch McConnell indicated, having acquitted Trump, that he still felt that Donald Trump incited the crowd to break into the Capitol. And it was an odd thing to watch Republicans saying, I'm going to acquit Donald Trump now in the Senate trial, but I think he ought to be prosecuted criminally. That's the best place to deal with this, which is not really a defense. Because when you're advocating that your former president should be dealt with through the criminal process rather than the political one, it's not really a resounding endorsement, is it?
Absolutely not. I think this throws up, I think for me, an interesting question about what are the responsibilities of social media companies in these particular cases. You know, if someone issued a direct threat that they were going to go out and murder somebody on social media, and or someone was indeed committing a violent act, then we'd expect the companies to respond to that swiftly and act against those statements. But at what point should they recognise that an incitement is taking place? They sort of cancelled Donald Trump's accounts after the event, but it begs the question: is it sort of okay to organise an incitement on Facebook, but the company only has to act when people start getting hurt? Should there be a test that they have to meet about recognising that hate speech or language that may cause an incitement to an insurrection, that their systems are being used to do that, and therefore they should intervene earlier to stop it? It's reached a point where there could be a wider harm to society if this was allowed to continue.
Yes, so the social media companies have been expert in slamming the barn door very, very hard after the horses bolted. And we saw in 2017 an incitement incited against the Rohingya in Myanmar by the Burmese military. And Facebook said that they, first of all, admitted that the genocide was incited on Facebook, and they said, we need to do better. And then again, in the 2016 elections, it was clear there was a great deal of disinformation, much of it run by Russian intelligence in our elections. And they said, yes, there was interference. All the security intelligence agencies in the United States confirmed this, and Facebook said, yes, we need to do better. Facebook also did not deplatform Donald Trump until Twitter had. And it's interesting that Twitter, who see themselves as kind of the cowboys of the Wild West of freedom of speech, were actually more aggressive in labeling Donald Trump's tweets after the election as disinformation or as not verified. And I think Twitter did make a good faith attempt in the aftermath of the election in late November, early December, to put labels on posts by Donald Trump and other followers of his, saying that their claims about the election had not been verified or were false. So it's interesting that occurred. I think that was a good development. Facebook came along quite a bit later than that. But the area of regulation, I will admit to you, Damon, is very difficult, because there are governments who would like to suppress speech about elections. There are governments who interfere in their own elections, and when citizens complain about that, they are suppressed. And a good example of this is Singapore, which passed a disinformation law in 2018. And the first individual post that they suppressed was someone in Singapore saying that the Singapore's elections were not free and fair. So we have to be very careful in requesting that the companies either take measures of their own or comply with government measures to regulate disinformation, that we don't hand either the companies or the governments a set of cudgels with which to beat their population. So this is a very fine line. And in a sense, each country requires its own special handling.
I think that's right. I think it is a very difficult issue. And I think when we think about, my particular perspective, thinking about the UK, is do we say, well, there are oppressive regimes in the world. They will take any opportunity to suppress speech in their country, but we need to do what we need to do to protect our own society and democracy as well. It's already been the case that I think in Belarus, I think they've copied some of the German hate speech laws that requires a removal of hate speech on social media, and they've applied them to suppress speech in their own country as well. And so I think there is that danger. But my concern at the moment is, by not acting, are we allowing a kind of a sickness to creep into our own society, that it's not just about volume of that sort of speech that circulates, but the harm that it can lead to. And I know in your work you've highlighted that in an election year in America now, it's not unusual to see a rise in hate crimes. We've seen persistent rise in hate crimes in the UK. I saw some data recently that said that over the last 6 years, there's been quite a big dramatic increase in the number of teenage girls that are self-harming. And you wonder, well, actually, is this pipe that goes into every moment of our lives that is social media, is it fueling this? And should there be some responsibility imposed on the companies that profit out of the circulation of that content, and even in some cases are recommending and promoting that content to its users through its engagement-based business model?
Yes. So these are the questions of our time, because it's clear that social media has been a boon in many ways for circulating information more quickly and more rapidly. I turn to Twitter when there's breaking news to see what's happening. I did that on January 6th to really try and see what was going on. And I saw video clips of the conflicts long before they appeared on television. So social media has provided an accessibility to information and a democratization and flattening of that spread of information in ways that are good for the democratic debate that we have about any one issue. But it's clear also that social media has taken a wrecking ball to our politics. And I think this is true in the United States, and I think it's true in other countries as well, where issues are not debated in a serious way. There are some very profound issues before us: the pandemic, global warming, inequality, racial justice, and they get debated in 280 plus characters or less. Disinformation spreads very quickly. There used to be gatekeepers, the BBC or ITN News or MSNBC News and CNN. There were gatekeepers who were preventing false stories from circulating, but that doesn't happen anymore. False stories circulate virally. And it's also that this information arrives in our pockets. It's not a television we can turn on or off. It's in the device that we carry with us and look at several hundred times a day. And what they're feeding us in our feeds is different for every person. And this is really one of the more worrying things, is that the polarization that we've seen in US society, which has always been there. Social media didn't invent it, but they exacerbated it by creating these echo chambers, these bubbles, so that individuals only see the information that confirms their prejudices and their worldview. They never see anything that challenges that. And the other thing is that the platforms elevate hate speech. They have algorithms, and the algorithms elevate any speech that gathers our attention. So if it grabs our attention and it means that we click on it or we repost it or we like it, then it keeps elevating it. It keeps spreading that. And that could be a very ugly, hateful, or inciting or threatening message. So the platforms, we have to recall what they do. They sell ads. They sell data about us. And so they want us to interact as much as possible. And they know psychologically that hate speech grabs our attention in a way that other types of speech, except for sort of cute kittens and people falling on the ice, doesn't. So a well-reasoned, argued, economically informed case about how to deal with the pandemic is going to bore most people, but something that's inflammatory, that's really grabbing your attention by using graphic speech and metaphors, then they're going to elevate that. So the whole business model is built around circulating information that is inflammatory. And Elizabeth Warren, our senator from Massachusetts, called Facebook a hate-for-profit machine. And, she wasn't far off.
And absolutely. I mean, we've got Charles Krill with us, and I want to bring him into the conversation in a moment. But before I do, as a law professor, I just want to know your opinion on, do you think, given the work you've done, looking at freedom of speech rights people have in America, that there will be a case that will require the Supreme Court to revisit the Brandenburg judgment and maybe come up with a new definition of what constitutes hate speech? And do you think there will be a successful reform of Section 230 that will create some new liabilities in America for social media companies to be more proactive in acting against hate speech on their platforms that could incite violence?
Well, these are the $64 million questions that you're asking. I actually think Brandenburg creates a good test for incitement. Why? Because it looks at the advocacy of the speech, the content of the speech, and it also requires that we examine context. So the imminence piece, the imminence prong, and the probability element, they require that we look at the surrounding context of the speech. And so I don't think Brandenburg is a terrible decision. Now, there hasn't been enough guidance on it. The Supreme Court has not said anything about Brandenburg since 1969. And yet social media has arisen. The world is a completely different place than it was 51 years ago. So it would be very useful if the Supreme Court in the United States revisited Brandenburg, not in order to revise it or reverse it or repeal it, but simply to flesh it out and provide more guidance on, okay, what are the circumstances in which a speech act could be considered inciting? Let's look more closely at the types of contexts that lend themselves to violence and the type of contexts where we want to permit the speech, even though it may be reprehensible. So we do need a much clearer drawing of a line between that speech which is repugnant, but we have to tolerate in the interests of democratic deliberation, and that speech which crosses the line into a true threat or an incitement to violence. And I would love to see the Supreme Court revisit that and give it much more consideration than it has over the last 51 years. Section 230. So this is a really tough question, and I don't claim to have the perfect answer to it. But my inclination now is to say that we should not repeal Section 230, but we should amend it. And the amendment should require that social media companies take, in quotes, reasonable measures to prevent hate speech, disinformation, and threats from appearing on their platform. And that reasonable measures or reasonable steps is an industry standard. And I think the first implication of that would be to make very vulnerable to civil action a number of platforms like Gab, like Parler, like 4chan, and others. Those platforms do not have any community guidelines or hate speech guidelines. 4chan pretends to, but they're essentially a satire on having guidelines. And those platforms are horrible places where really bad speech occurs, and you can see video streamed attacks on religious minorities, violent events, and so on. There's no effort made. And if those platforms were regulated out of existence, I think that would be no bad thing. It would also compel the platforms and concentrate their minds to think harder about how they regulate. Now, I don't believe that just, slapping them with civil lawsuits is the only way that we can grapple with this problem. And I would like to see, the deeper problem is these are private corporations, some of the biggest in the world, determining the speech in the public square that we rely upon for our democracies. And they act without any accountability except for to their shareholders. And there has to be, because of the importance of the speech on their platforms for our democracies, when you think 2.4 billion users on Facebook and many, many hundreds of millions on Twitter, it's just too important to leave to private corporations to decide on a whim what they're going to do or not do. There has to be some administrative agency oversight. And in the United States, we have a Federal Communications Commission, we have a Federal Electoral Commission, and these commissions have had a very hands-off approach to the platforms, and that needs to change. So I see looking at this problem holistically, a little bit of guidance on Brandenburg, amending Section 230, and getting our administrative government agencies to really tackle the problem of social media, hate speech, and disinformation, and provide guidelines for the corporations, and have some measure of oversight. Because right now, there's simply no oversight, and we've seen what that's done to our polity.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Richard. Now, Charles, it was great to have you with us as always. And I know that you've been thinking about Parler over the last few days, and it's good to hear Richard talking about that as well.
Yes, absolutely. It looks like there are some new developments over at Parler, even since the last time we spoke, and those developments may have a profound impact on UK social media, and particularly Great Britain's conservative online space. The last time we spoke at length about Parler, their CEO, John Matz, had just been sacked by the board, and it was in a move apparently led by Rebecca Mercer. Matz claimed that when he tried to steer the platform toward moderation of some of the more far-right elements, he was met with silence from Mercer, and that is until he was ushered out the door. Now, Rebecca Mercer is the daughter of billionaire Robert Mercer, who's famed for early work on IBM's Watson, his use of big data in market investment, but most recently his support of right-wing causes. He's one of the big players in Republican politics, as is his daughter, and he was not only the founder of Breitbart, but also founded Cambridge Analytica along with Steve Bannon and Alexander Nix. Now, his daughter Rebecca came into the Cambridge Analytica story when she sat on the board of Emerdata, which was a short-lived company formed of the ashes of Cambridge Analytica. She then went on to co-found Parler with the recently departed Matz. Now, Mercer and her board have appointed a new interim CEO, Mark Meckler, and they've put the platform in the hands of a new executive committee. It's made up of Meckler, who co-founded the Tea Party Patriots, and he's a member of the Council for National Policy, which we've spoken of before, and his partner Matthew Richardson in this executive committee. And the reason this is interesting for the UK is because Matthew Richardson is not only close to Steve Bannon, and he's not only an occasional lawyer for Robert Mercer, but he was also party secretary for UKIP. And according to The Guardian, he was partly responsible for pushing UKIP in the direction of far-right politics. Brittany Kaiser, who was a witness to the DCMS Select Committee inquiry, submitted evidence in April 2018, and Richardson appears throughout this written letter that she sent in. She says, quote, Cambridge Analytica was initially engaged with Aaron Banks, Andy Wigmore, and Matthew Richardson to design parallel proposals for Leave EU, Go Skippy, Eldon Insurance, and the UK Independence Party, UKIP. I, being she, was asked by Nix and Wheatland to take the lead on contract negotiations, end of quote. Now, let's note here, too, that the Leave EU campaign and Go Skippy, owned by Aaron Banks, have just lost an appeal against more than £100,000 of fines for data protection violations related to the EU referendum campaign. And the companies were issued the fines a couple of years ago for including promotions for Banks' Go Skippy insurance brand in emails to Leave EU subscribers in 2016 and 2017. But back to the transcripts of the inquiry, Ian Lucas asked the question, quote, so when you were pitching, did you think that you were pitching to UKIP or Leave EU? And Brittany Kaiser answered, I knew that I was pitching to Leave EU, although Matthew Richardson, the press party secretary, was part of those meetings almost every time. I knew that UKIP was a public supporter of the Leave EU campaign and that much of the work that we were being asked to design in our proposals was going to be either parallel or joint work streams. So Richardson is in the evidence throughout, and he has also in his past caught a bit of press attention. In 2015, he said bigots, quote, deserve representation, and then he called the NHS the Reichstag bunker of socialism. He's also been photographed with Nigel Farage exiting Trump's golden elevator in 2017. This man is all over Trump Brexit politics and is another marker of how closely aligned the two have been at times. It's interesting that he's turning up again now, Damian, after The Guardian has called out Farage for making anti-lockdown sentiment his new territory, after Chris Wiley has talked about how Nix and Mercer always wanted their own social media network, and as Parler looks set to relaunch. Although it was initially a US-driven platform with Richardson close to the wheels, it now looks like the UK is about to become a big part of its footprint.
Thank you, Charles. And I think going back to what we were talking with Richard about Trump in America, I think the story of Parler shows that just because Trump's out of office, his supporters aren't going to go away.
No, his supporters aren't going to go away. And although Parler has been acted against by Google and acted against by Apple and acted against by Amazon Web Services shutting down their back end, they've now reached out to Russia for at least domain hosting, which soon they'll find themselves outside the jurisdiction of a lot of legislation. We'll find ourselves dependent upon big companies to try to shut them down, just as governments and big companies are in uncomfortable negotiations, Australia being an example of that. And all the while, the supporters are still out there, and they'll move around from platform to platform.
And I think we don't probably fully understand yet what the consequences have been of so much sort of poison being pumped into the system for so long, and the way in which even if we're successful in getting more sensible regulation on sites like Facebook, that new networks can be established that can be potentially even more dangerous.
Absolutely. And we may well be looking at a situation where January 6th wasn't the end, but it's the beginning of something in politics across the next few years, which is worrying. It
is worrying. And we've seen and talked about on the show how in other countries around the world, this is not uncommon for incitement to lead to violence as a result of a campaign on social media. And before we close, Richard, just to ask you again, you particularly singled out these these smaller networks and sites. I mean, do you think we should be concerned that the sort of incitement that we've seen on social media so far could be the foothills of the problem, and that actually the manipulation of these other networks to incite strong feelings in people could lead to bigger problems in the future?
Well, that's certainly a possibility. However, getting the individuals who want to incite a revolution against liberal democracy off of Facebook and off of Twitter and off of Reddit is an achievement, because what it does is forecloses their access to the mainstream and to other people who they wish to convert. So if they are pushed on to other fringe platforms where they're essentially talking to themselves, I see that as advantageous for democracy. What has been remarkable over the last 4 years is the degree to which those individuals and organizations who are considered marginal, fringe, militia-oriented, white nationalists who really had not done well in the political sphere had managed to move into the mainstream. Now, that's mostly through the person of Donald Trump, but also through the networks of social media. And so getting them out of the mainstream, I see as an essential part. I completely agree with Charles that this is not the end. This is the beginning. We have in the United States a domestic terrorism problem. That's not going away. I lived in Britain for 2 decades, part of which during an IRA bombing campaign. And I know that a small number of people can create an awful lot of trouble. And so we have those domestic terrorists in the United States, and that's going to be a long road. We also have a bigger problem in some ways, in that one of our main political parties appears to not be committed to the democratic process anymore. A majority of senators, Republican senators, and Republicans in the House of Representatives voted to overturn the results of the election. That must give us pause, because we got through this time, but the pendulum of politics swings, and it may well swing back to the Republicans, and they may well decide to short circuit the processes and established institutional policies of democracy. So that to me is very worrying. Look, I don't mind there being a loyal opposition in conservative politics, but it's moved beyond that to saying that they're now actually a minority in the United States, and they can't win elections fairly, and so they're going to turn to subterranean and in this case violent methods in order to achieve power, and that just worries me a great deal.
Absolutely, it's a threat we have to be alive to and act against. But Richard Wilson, it's fantastic to have you with us on the podcast today, and Charles, great to hear from you again as always. You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Richard Wilson and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, Infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also support this show by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/Infotagion podcast. Infotagion is a not-for-profit organisation, and all proceeds will go towards the making of this podcast. Thank you until next time.